Hi, everyone. So, just telling more spiritual, mystical, magical stories. Many years ago, the one of the American shaman who had been trained in the Peruvian tradition that I knew, and that for a couple of years I actually did trips to Peru with him. And I created a project that we saw that was needed in Peru, and we called it Cows and Roofs for Kids. And what we were trying to do is we were trying to go into areas that we saw street children really struggling, and we tried to figure out what they needed in order to have a home or to create safety and security and stability. And so we did a donation basis. So I had a little donation thing that was in my house for my clients, and said if you want to donate 100% of this money will actually go to creating Cows and Roofs for Kids. And so we had this idea that we were going to create housing for children, which ended up being a much more difficult thing than we realized. So of course, you start these projects and then you realize that it's not about what you want to give somebody, but it's about what they need. And I think a lot of groups, including ourselves, made the mistake that we thought we knew what they needed. And so we saw that there was this disabled children's orphanage. So disabled children oftentimes get left on the street to die, because the people in Peru don't have enough money to afford to be able to take care of them. And so they end up, at this disabled children's orphanage. And these children have a lot of, problems. They are, retarded. They have a lot of health problems. Their head is the wrong size. And there's all these things. And so we saw this beautiful orphanage and had a huge courtyard. And what we thought was, well, this is a perfect place to have a milk cow. And we're going to buy a cow, which is why it was called Cows and Roofs for Kids. We're going to buy a cow, a milk cow, and then the people at the orphanage will have milk for the kids, which they need. And we thought this would be really helpful. And so we spent a fortune getting a milk cow moved from a remote area all the way on a train. And then we bought a year's worth of feed and the milk cow and set up an area for the milk cow. And we felt so accomplished. This was a huge hassle, and it was a very hard thing because nobody wants to let go of a milk cow. And it, so we get this cow all the way there. And what ends up happening was we left the orphanage, and the people who owned the orphanage sold the cow for meat and got them money for meat, and then bought food for the children. But they basically killed the milk cow, and then they sold all of our feed, and and so this thing ended up being a total waste of energy, time, effort, and it was a disaster. And that's when we learned that maybe it's not about what we want to give everybody, but it's about what they need. And so we had another opportunity where there was a family that had lost their mother and father, and this little girl was, I think, 11 or 12 years old, and she was trying to take care of her her brother and her sister that were younger than her, and they had no place to live, and so they were living on top of a spring that was coming out of a mountain. And so you can imagine that this was a horrible situation. There were rocks, and it was cold, and it's damp, and it's wet. And so we got the village to come together. We asked the shaman, what do they need? And they said, well, we need mud bricks, and we're going to build a platform on top of these rocks. So then we got the villagers to come together and, create a base for the platform. And then once it was level, they channeled the spring so that it was going underneath the house, if you can believe this, and which was really handy for doing dishes and getting fresh water. It was perfect because it was coming right out of the spring. And then we put mud bricks down, and then we put rebar up, and then we got a tin roof, which was really expensive. It was like $400 for the tin roof, and it had to be shipped in on a train, and then that cost more and everything. And this was the one thing that we did that actually worked, because she put rebar higher than the building we built, because then she could make her own mud bricks, and she actually made a second floor. And so then she was living with her brothers and sisters on the upper floor, and then she was renting the lower floor to the trainmen. And because of that, she had money, and she could feed her brothers and sister. So that was one thing we were really, really proud of. And when the other shaman went back, they were so happy to see him. I mean, I wasn't there, but they were so happy to see him and so grateful because, we had created stability for that small little family of 3. We thought about doing another project, and we actually had a lot of things starting to come together. That the high altitude lakes had been overfished, and so they'd been fished out. And so we thought, well, what would it be like to to fly fish with helicopters into the upper altitude lakes? Well, that ended up being, of course, a complete and total disaster. So it was a terrible idea, but I thought it was a good idea. And then we also had an idea where we were going to do a llama roundup and bring llamas from Bolivia into Peru, but we had to bring them up and over the mountains, which were really high. That also ended up being a disaster. So we had all these ideas that we thought we would help the people, and once again, Americans with their ideas, it doesn't necessarily work the way you think it's going to work, and so that failed. Those ideas failed. But one out of 4, one out of 4 actually worked. And I loved bringing people to Peru, because when you take people out of their environment, and you put them into a very different culture, a very different language, and a very different spiritual base or belief, people grow. They expand and they grow. It's almost like we're hungry for alternative experiences to spirituality and consciousness than our own. And it's so easy to do that. And yet, as with all cultural differences, you have to also be aware that, Americans walk in, and I'm guilty of this, Americans walk in and we throw a lot of money at something, and rarely does that actually work. And over and over again, it failed, like I said, miserably. And the shaman were used to the Americans kind of coming in and wanting to throw a lot of money and a lot of self-importance into things, and they would manipulate them. And it's one of the reasons that I stopped taking people to Peru, because there were shaman that were like, oh, if you would just, they would take my clients and they'd say, oh, if you give me $10,000, I will clear your karma. I'll do a despacho and I'll clear your karma for, for your lifetime. And I was like, wait, stop. Nobody can clear your karma for you. You have to clear your karma for you. And you need to do the work, not pay a shaman to do the work for you. And that always ends up blowing up in your face, because then you just get dependent on thinking, I can buy my way to heaven, or I can buy my way out of my own karmic suffering. And that never works. It's like, I don't care what anybody says. Like, yes, you can participate in the process, and you can do the journeys, and you can do the work that the shaman asks you to do, but to pay the shaman to just do that, it was like, ugh. So, what I have found is that in poorer cultures, the shaman are highly manipulative when it comes to knowing how to play the Americans, because we have too much money, and we basically want to pay exorbitant amounts of money for a spiritual experience. And over again, I found for myself in Peru that I didn't need the shaman. I usually needed the magic that was in the land, the magic that was in the wind, the magic that was in the earth, and the shaman could help focus that. But it was actually me having the experience that became more important. So, be willing to put yourself into a place that might feel a little bit uncomfortable. Give yourself permission to have an amazing spiritual experience. I had some friends of mine that were kayakers, and they were in Chile. I think they were in Chile. And they were taking a break from boats, and they decided to hike up to this very remote area and look at a glacier and go up and over the pass. And so in the process of going up there, one of my friends badly broke his leg, like shattered his tibia. and was in a lot of pain. And there was no way he could hike off the mountain. And so his friends said, okay, we're going to try and splint you. We're going to leave you with all the water and all the food, and we're going to run down the mountain, and we're going to get mules, and we're going to come back up, and we're going to take you down in a mule. And by the time, we do all of that, it'll probably be 3 days. So we're making sure you have 3 days of water and food. Here's the pain pills that we've got. Don't move, stay put, and we'll be back. And you have to remember, again, this was a friend of mine that was doing this in the late 1980s. So let's just say cell phones and things like that were not happening in Peru. And this friend of mine, he said that he was laying there in a in pain fog, and he opens his eyes, and here's this little brown face looking at him, and speaking in the language of that area, which is a dialect, and they didn't understand each other. And this little man started just making this poultice and started making this drink in with a fire, and handed my friend this glass to drink out of, and said, drink this. And it smelled like poo. My friend said it smelled like poo. But he drank it and almost gagged all the way down, and the guy made him drink the whole thing. And so he thought, well, it can't be that bad because it was boiled, and so at least it's been boiled, and so I won't die of dysentery or something. And then he passed out, and he doesn't know what happened for 3 days. So for 3 days, my friend was unconscious. And when he came to, his friends were shaking him violently, like, wake up, are you alive? Wake up. And he comes out of this drug-induced haze, and they said, who set your leg? And he looked down, and here was his leg. It was perfectly set, and it was wrapped in mud and moss and leaves, and it was tied with strings, and it should have been black and blue and swollen, and it was not. It looked just like a normal leg. And my friends were like, wow, that's crazy. And they stood up, and he tried to put weight on his leg, and he could actually stand on his leg. And he was like, that's crazy. I mean, I had a shattered tibia. Like, that's nuts. And so they threw him on the mule, and they took him down the hill, and they took him to the doctor, and they took an x-ray of his leg. And they said, it looks like your leg has been in this splint for 4.5 weeks. And it had been 3 days. And this is where I do love the magic of shamanism. It's like, number one, something would heal probably really well if you were in pain and you were out of pain and not moving. And the bones could knit and splint and everything pretty good, and then you take the swelling down and, all this kind of stuff. And so clearly who had found him was a little shaman that had some skills and just knocked him out, and then yanked his leg and straightened it and set it back in place. And then, God loved the shaman. And so I know that there are amazing shaman out there that have amazing skills of healing and abilities. And, but I over and over again say to people, just remember that just because somebody has a magical skill does not mean they can use it with integrity. And this shaman obviously did use it with integrity, which is great. But I have met plenty of shaman, American, as well as, South American, that were out for the money. They were out for the money, and they, Americans and their arrogance, where they're just like, well, they'll pay me anything I want, kind of thing. And so, I think it's always important to not be fooled. And this time that we're in the world, I think that there's a lot of people that got fooled. And I think it happens a lot, I think you have to really listen to your core and listen to your insides to know when you're being consciously manipulated. So that's another little Peru story, and then my friend's little Chile story. So talk to you later. Bye.